Good morning. Good morning. I think we can see an audience. The lights are quite bright. We have a cracking panel for you. I can tell you this because for the last couple of minutes we've been having a fantastic discussion. And we're going to be looking at the question of designing for fairness. I'll just briefly let you know who our panelists are. We've got Nóra Loideain, who is an academic. We have Kit Collingwood. We have Martin Tisné and Claire Melamed. And we'll be chatting for a good 25 or 30 minutes, then what I would like to get some questions from the audience. We did have an iPad to take the questions, but the iPad has disappeared. If anyone wants to own up to it, there is an amnesty. So there will be microphones running around the audience. What I'd like to do is just ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves so we can get a sense of what you care about, maybe starting with you, Nóra.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks to Jenny and the ODI team for the invitation to be here today. I'm Nóra Loideain. I'm Director and Lecturer in Law of the Information Law and Policy Centre at the Institute for Advanced Legal Studies. And I'm really interested in the governance models and regulatory frameworks that will govern open data and data sharing going forward.
I'm Kit Collingwood. Thank you for having me here today. I'm Head of Data Transformation for the Department for Work and Pensions. And my particular interest in this is in organisational readiness and incentives to share data and in the leadership that we need to be able to do it.
Good morning. My name is Martin Tisné. I'm Managing Director at Luminate, which is a philanthropic organisation. And I'm very keen to talk about issues of data ownership and whether if we own our data, does it make it more fair, more equitable, or should we have rights of our data? I'm also keen to talk about questions of fairness. Is there one definition of fairness? Are there several?
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name's Claire Melamed, and I'm the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. We are very practical in our approach, which is to create the kind of partnerships and the collaborations that can actually solve problems, particularly in some of the poorest parts of the world.
Fantastic. Four different interpretations of the question. I mean, the way I look at this is it is a complex question. We're in the middle of a second enclosure movement where private firms are building fences around intellectual property and data for their own benefit and for the restraints on innovation. We have challenges of how unfair data or poor data can lead to prejudicial outcomes, particularly at the wrong end of algorithmic systems. We also know that the lack of access to data or the lack of the capabilities to make use of it can prevent equitable access to services. And we have questions about what is the fair share that consumers should get or indeed are they entitled to a fair share of the use of their data. And finally, as we look forward, what are the skills and tools and capabilities that we already have in order to make sense of this world in a fair and equitable way, and what are the new ones that we need to build? I mean, it's such a hot subject, this one, that I've got a little story from the Wall Street Journal from today, which is slightly terrifying. I'm just going to read you out this one sentence. The Wall Street Journal's reporter visits a company that claims its algorithm can identify potential terrorists by their facial features alone, which sounds a little bit risky. Don't look at me, please. Martin, just for you as a question there, you gave me an example earlier of data resulting in sort of unfair outcomes. Would you want to just sort of share that example
Sure.
and what the issue there was?
Sure, no, I'm happy to. So it's an example that many of you will be familiar with. It's the issue of an algorithm developed by a firm called Northpoint, United States, that is used to develop risk scores for people who are going through the criminal justice system, and you would get a score, and that would say whether you are more likely to recidivate, and it would also help set bail and help sentencing. And so an investigation by a great journalism outfit called ProPublica found that that risk score was biased, and it was biased against black defendants. Then what was fascinating is there was a huge debate between the company, Northpoint, and ProPublica as to who was right and why. And I think what we saw there were competing definitions and visions for what fairness means. So effectively what Northpoint argued is that their approach was fair because it maximized the true positives. So it maximized, if you're the decision maker, in this case, the number of people who were deemed high risk, who then recidivated, was correct. From ProPublica's perspective, they looked at the defendant. They took the defendant's perspective, and they were saying, so from the defendant's perspective, what you're interested in is to minimize the false positives. So you want to minimize the likelihood of you being labeled as high risk, but you not recidivating. So I think it's a fascinating example because it shows that fairness is a question of perspective, and ultimately, we will only agree on it if we agree as societies what is the moral framework that we want to be operating in. And one of the things that concerns me a lot right now is in the computer science field, there's a race to define fairness. And so this is a quote from a computer science working on ethics saying, it's a bit like adding apples and fairness and finding that the answer is 7.3. And it's just clearly not the way to go about it. And what we need to do is bring together those working on computer science with those working on philosophy, those working on the law, and understand, do we want a society where we are maximizing the number of people who are high risk who will recidivate? Are we looking at it from the perspective of the decision maker, of the judge, or are we looking at it from an equitable perspective, I would argue, also from the perspective of the defendant?
Which perspective do you think we should be taking?
Well, I think it's interesting that you say about the confusion around what fairness means, because there are lots of examples of what fairness means legally speaking, and we have them in so many different models. You can look at the General Data Protection Regulation, for example, in terms of data processing, like from Northpoint, for example, and Compass. I mean, were these transparent processes? Did they have good governance approaches? In terms of fairness and proportionality, for example, was that system responding to a pressing social need? So I think we should be very careful when we go into this new space to acknowledge that we've got lots of emerging technologies, but a lot of this is old wine in new bottles in terms of good governance. Thank you. And we should pay consideration and not walk into this blindly and look at old models that we can draw from. I think Martin raises a really good point in terms of the disagreement we have internationally in terms of making values about fairness society specific, depending on, your approach in Africa, that may vary a lot to European values in North America. We only have to look at data privacy legislation to see that. But globally, we should look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We should look at the European Convention of Human Rights. We have the Data Protection Act here for 2018. There's already considerable guidance on what can be defined as fair when you look at a lot of human rights legislation, particularly data privacy and data protection.
Can you give a particular example out of one of those frameworks that is that maybe illustrates it?
Yes, okay, well, we've already had mentioned this morning about data trusts and how that may be a governance model going forward to share data more openly. And what I would be very interested in seeing there is the process behind this in terms of how lawful it will be, how transparent it will be, how accountable it will be, where the independent oversight is coming from, for example. And these aren't novel questions. In the 1960s, we had environmental impact assessments, we had social impact assessments, the impact on society, the kinds of questions we're asking now. Then we had privacy impact assessments in the 1990s. Now with GDPR, I'm the first person to mention it today, I think.
You've said it twice now.
I said it twice already.
That's right.
Said it twice. So under that, we have the data protection impact assessment. And legally speaking, if we're going to be setting up data trusts with massive amounts of data, with serious risks in terms of data security and in terms of the implications for people's privacy, questions about consent, we're going to have data protection impact assessments. But this is about open data. We need to think more broadly what's for the public interest. So we also need to have open data impact assessments. What's benefiting society? We can't think just negatively about how we need to protect the data. We also need to know how we value the data.
I'm curious about, Claire, you work in the Global South with a lot of your, with your organization. Is governance the thing that perhaps holds back the use of data in that environment?
It's one of the things. I mean, one of the things that we hear a lot from companies in particular who are being kind of lobbied or, asked to share their data for certain specific purposes, mobile phone companies who are being asked to share their data because there are things that we know work in terms of using mobile phone data to track the spread of epidemics, for example. We know that stuff works. We know that it would be incredibly useful for governments that, are very short on resources and don't have any other way to do it. But we know that for very good reasons, companies are very reluctant to even discuss that because there's no regulatory framework that will protect them from the reputational risk, from the commercial risk of having their data shared in that way. So there is absolutely an issue with regulation. I mean, I should say that maybe the second person to mention GDPR today, that it's what I'm finding interesting is that certainly the GDPR is, the sort of assumption is that the GDPR is going to be used as the model for those regulatory frameworks. There's a lot of fear about that because there's a lot of nervousness about the way that might stifle innovation, that might prevent all sorts of things happening, particularly absent the kind of sophisticated legal and regulatory institutions that allow those things to be implemented in a sort of nuanced way that can explicitly balance all of those different interests. So there's a sort of anxiety, there's an awareness of a sort of regulatory void and an absence of regulation which is preventing good stuff from happening. There's also an anxiety about what is becoming the model for regulation and whether that is actually appropriate to those contexts. But I also think that the reason why data's value is not being used to solve some of these big problems, achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, is partly about the data, but a huge amount of it is actually about some really basic stuff that we've almost stopped thinking about here. It's about whether
I
there
want
are
to get to that in a
people.
second. Yeah, I just want to bring Kit in, if I may, because what I'm hearing sort of consistently is the value of the right type of governance in getting these systems to work properly. Is that your experience as well within DWP?
Yeah, it is. I would say regulation is, the regulation framework isn't where it needs to be, but to pick up on what Claire said, I think the bigger blocker for me isn't the emerging regulatory framework and how we wield it and don't wield it, but the skills we have within organisations to have a mature understanding of how we're using data and the basic skill set we need to be able to exploit it properly without exploiting people. And that's one of the really big questions, how do you exploit data without exploiting humans? That's one of the things that we need to look at. I think thinking about the outcomes we're hoping to reach will help us wrestle with this question of what fairness is, because if you are, for example, with reoffending, which happens to be something I worked on for many years, it depends what you're trying to do in a reoffending space. So are you attempting to rehabilitate an offender? Is that your primary objective? Are you attempting to protect society? Is that your primary objective? Or you're attempting organisational efficiency and effectiveness, which is the third objective of any framework about how you assess risk around offender management. So looking for the primary outcome you're going to will help you struggle with that. And the other thing, to be the third person who mentions GDPR, GDPR is one of a regulatory framework which needs to grow and expand. But I think it is a tiny subset of how we do. I would rather have a general actual protection regulation than a general data protection regulation, because how we protect the most vulnerable people in our society will never be handled by regulation, will be handled entirely by the humans who deal with data, and that's what I think we should be focusing on.
Martin, you look like you're going to butt in, and you're all allowed to butt in.
Allowed to butt in. Okay. So just to be a little provocative on the GDPR piece, I worry quite a bit that we over-individualize the impact of data, and that it's rooted in a 1970s sort of 40-plus-year-old consensus around data protection that focuses on the impact on individuals. And one big thing I've learned this year after Cambridge Analytica is that the impact of data is on individuals and on our societies. And as a privacy community, we spend decades, as Tim was saying, arguing to people that, you will have impacts on your life as a person, Martin, if, your data is abused. And now what we've seen is that that's true, and it's also true that if 87 million Facebook accounts, get misused in different ways. It can also impact societal decisions. And I think what GDPR misses at this point, partly because it's rooted, not that I disagree with, I think it's both and, in a sort of an approach which is very individualized around data protection, it misses the impact on the collective, right? It misses the impact on society. So to our panel, for me, it's about growing data's value for market citizens and societies. And I think that unless we grapple with that and we start looking at data as a collective good and people's rights and responsibilities as citizens and societies around it, we will be in big trouble in the decade to come.
Yeah, because a large part of the value from data is an emergent property. It emerges from the fact that we have lots of it. A single journey from Holloway to Peckham is not useful. Millions of journeys across London together in aggregate emerges a sense of sort of real-time value around how the traffic is flowing.
But that's a positive. There's a positive example,
positive, yeah.
the Waze one.
A positive is a negative.
Yeah, but the negative example, back to the risk assessment scores one, a lot of people, so on the data ownership piece, a lot of people say, well, own your data and you'll be empowered, you'll have control and agency over it. If I'm a black defendant in a state with a risk assessment score, owning my data will do absolutely nothing to that score, right? It's other people's, it's information, it's data about other people that informs a decision about me. And then me going through the system will then feed the algorithm in a feedback loop. The chances that all of those, in this case, black defendants in that state will own their data and by collective action unionize to stop the software from using it, I think it is nil.
Can I just
Yeah, of
take
course,
the time
yeah.
to heartily agree with that? So there's a lot of rhetoric going on, do I want to say neoliberal? There's a market-based rhetoric about empowering people through giving them ownership of their own data. And it is, let's not pretend there's a single thing called society. There are different societies. And one aspect of society is a bunch of really, really vulnerable people, none of which regularly use the internet, let alone would know what we're doing with their data. And to pretend that you're empowering them through giving them their own data is naive to the point of being abusive, I think.
Yeah.
Well, and so how do you go about looking after the most vulnerable? I mean, when any of us use an internet service, there's a long T's and C's that you have to sign up for, which I'm sure says something about how our data is going to be used, but I've confessed to having never read one of them. So how do we think about ensuring that those people are not vulnerable, in the sense of the degree of data literacy digital literacy you now need is rather high?
Well, to follow up on that, and to somewhat disagree respectfully with the points that you made in terms of individual privacy, I think it's very dangerous to go down a route to say that, the privacy of the individual isn't as important anymore. It's still very important. It's the building blocks that form these profiles and these larger aggregate data sets. So what's become increasingly important is to recognize the collective good and also the collective harm of data, but then not to throw away the importance of individual privacy. That's still important, but both should be valued. Just to clarify that. I completely agree with your concerns, Azeem, about the consent myth. I don't know how many of us, tick that box, and legally speaking, that's meant to be informed and it's meant to be meaningful consent, but who has the time? Who has the resources to read the terms and conditions for every app update, for every service that you decide to consent to? And I think that builds on Kit's concerns about the fact that, there's only so much we can do to be empowered. We should be empowered, but there should also be other checks and balances and oversights and safeguards, which is why we have independent oversight authorities, for example, like data protection authorities. And just to follow up as well, in terms of the GDPR is not the silver bullet to all of our problems, not by long shot. We've got issues in terms of competition law. We've got issues in terms of data taxation that have also been raised. But at the heart of it all, and Kit raised this earlier too, it's also about the governance process. We can have all the most fantastic laws on statute books, but in process, if the governance isn't happening, if the enforcement isn't happening, then we end up with these situations like Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, where the rules simply aren't enforced. So it really does come back to meaningful oversight and process.
We'll get on to that. Claire had something to add.
I think it's interesting how this debate on sort of privacy and rights to privacy is a bit divorced from other debates on human rights and how they should be implemented, which actually can be helpful here. So we have a right to clean air or clean water. But that doesn't mean that we're all individually responsible for cleaning our air and cleaning our water. It means that those rights that we have as citizens confer a responsibility on the state to provide us with that. And I think it would be helpful to think about the right to privacy, and that way you can have a right to privacy, sure, but that doesn't mean it's your responsibility as an individual to do all the work and all the reading and all the sort of have all the information that will allow you personally to safeguard that right. That's what we have governments for in every other area of human rights, so why not this one?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think the other big thing I've learned this year is that data is basically an expression of power. I should have learned it ages ago, I guess. But, it's the power of those who collected the data, the power of those who designed the technology. And our response to power imbalances is you create a rights framework. And then the response to rights framework is not to say, Claire, here are your human rights, get on with it. It's to create a framework around that for governments to safeguard it. Where I would add to your points is to say that I don't think we're anywhere close to the data rights, and I would say data rights infrastructure we need right now in our societies. I think we need to have data rights boards in companies and in governments that play a role to safeguard people's rights around data. I think we need to have a whole class of algorithmic auditors who are looking at auditing the data sets according to certain standards. You were talking about processes earlier. I think we need to have, ethical standards, certification sets. There's a whole set of infrastructural needs at this point that we don't have, that we have in other parts of human rights. And that's what I look forward to building in order to answer that question.
Can I build on that in a slightly naff-analogous way? So thinking about the right to... So the point I'm trying to make is about partnership models between government regulation and the private sector. If you think about having a right to clean air, you can say you have a right to clean air as much as you like, and you can regulate for it, and you can regulate for example, emissions. And then, was it Volkswagen who got fined for gaming the emissions regulations? So in the kind of stonking naivety that exists between government and the private sector should be a specific focus of some of this work, because the regulatory framework can exist and look absolutely spanking on paper, but if people are either able to game it or exploit it in ways that are sort of geographically unfair, so extreme levels of pollution in inner cities, for example, or the regulation at a global level will do absolutely nothing. There has to be this partnership model where we make law in a way that is mature and cross-sector, I think.
Claire, please.
And I completely agree with that, and I think that comes back to what I suspect you're going to try to move us on to in a minute, which is the kind of capacity and skills thing. I think the reason why the governments were able to find out about Volkswagen was because they had people working for government who were qualified to do that testing and understand the results. And I think the public sector is running so far behind the private sector in terms of the capacities that exist to understand the data environment, data processing, what this all is about and how to use it, that I think we're quite a long way off actually being able to do that. But that should be something that we think about in terms of a policy agenda around this.
You've got some particular experience of your own, I think, which I think is worth sharing.
Absolutely. I think one of the often getting the value, we focused a lot on frameworks for data itself, and that's absolutely a part of the issue. But I think a lot of what is required to get value out of data for citizens and for the sort of outcomes that we all want to see in different parts of the world is actually nothing to do with data. It's about people, it's about the infrastructures. One of the things that we have done recently is work with our partner governments in Africa to create a data infrastructure that gives them access to Earth observations data. Now, this is all data that was open, has been open for years. So it wasn't about access to that data, but they weren't using it because they didn't have the computing capacity, they didn't have the cloud infrastructure or the broadband speeds to be able to use it, and most especially, they didn't have the people to be able to use it. I can just have a second to tell, one story. I was sitting in the Ministry of Agriculture in Kenya. Reasonably, a lot of skilled people in Kenya, a huge, as many of you will know, a huge sort of data culture. But sitting there and agriculture, massively important part of the economy, employs a large numbers of people, sitting in the Ministry of Agriculture talking about open data and Earth observations data. This is the very beginning of this project and trying to sort of get excited about the different things I could do. And the guy that I was sitting there said, yes, all very well, that all sounds marvelous, but you must understand it's just me. I am the only person in the whole of the Ministry of Agriculture in the government of Kenya who is qualified to actually handle data, to understand data, to process data. So kind of all of these shiny toys you're dangling in front of me about, all of this open data and what we can do with it, that sounds lovely, but, and I think there's a huge sort of inequality and unfairness here about actually who has the skills to use this and get that value.
But there's a tension that's emerging here because from your experience in Kenya, what we see is there isn't enough capability, human resources at the exploitation end. And then some of the other stories we've heard is that if you've got those capabilities and resources, the exploitation may end up being unfair. Yeah. So there's a tension between turning the engine on and then realizing the engine's going to spew out a bunch of fumes.
I mean, it's about where those resources are, and it's about, I think, a huge part of this is about equity between public and private sectors. And I don't know how you do that, short of finding the money to pay private sector salaries in the public sector to tempt all the data scientists there. But, I think that is a huge inequality that's emerging actually not only in African countries, but everywhere.
I'm going to warm the audience up to say we're going to turn to you shortly for questions. Can I just see where the mic might be? There's a mic. Okay, great. So there's one up the top, and then there'll be some down here. So if you do have a question after this next question, please pop your hand up.
Can I just follow up really quickly,
Of course,
Azeem?
yeah.
Just in a more positive, constructive note about what is actually happening in policy circles to address some of these very big questions. I think that it's very important that strategically that these are made a priority and that they're acknowledged. And I think at least one step forward in the right direction is the establishment of new multidisciplinary centres on data ethics and innovation, like we have in the UK, just launched this week. And these are built up of the kinds of different multidisciplinary stakeholders that Martin was talking about in terms of people with expertise in law, with technical expertise coming from the corporate world, so that you're not leaving out key perspectives and values that we should be having from the very start. Also, in terms of institutional capacity, that's a key factor for the public sector, not just in terms of technical expertise, understanding the algorithms, but also talking about addressing this question about, well, if we have laws like the GDPR, for example, that means innovation then is stopped in its tracks. We have to really move away from that narrative. Having safeguards is so important. It shouldn't be about anymore moving fast and breaking things. It should be about moving forward and building things. So as much as we can get to that place, that's a very significant cultural change that needs to happen in the private sector and in the public sector. And just one final note on that. When things do go well, the public sector aren't heard to be talking about it, because that's another institutional competency that's not there in terms of spreading the word of, like, here's best practice. Look what happened with TfL when it gave open access to all these different companies and 200 apps were built. I mean, how many people here use those apps? Like, that's a real tangible example of things going well. But again, we just don't talk about that enough, and that also has to be addressed.
Claire?
I completely agree, and one of the things that we focus on very much is actually talking about data not to people who care about data, but to politicians, and to try to sort of elevate the political profile of data, make that something that politicians can talk about around, look, you wanted better healthcare, but hey, this is how we're helping you to deliver it by building up a data infrastructure. So I think there's a whole sort of political agenda here, which again, we probably don't talk about enough.
Kit, you hang out with a few politicians.
Yeah, I love doing that. Within the public sector, one of the let's gloss over that.
They're the best.
One of the really relevant conversations to be had here is, what is the incentive for us to work more courageously with our data? And as far as I'm concerned, there isn't one. There are no incentives for us to be more open versus less open with our data. And I think until we start to have that conversation in the open, this kind of, I call it the silent screen, this kind of inner terror that I have building in myself, that all of the data expertise is sitting in the private sector and we're effectively a naive buyer of it, or a naive consumer of their advice. Exactly the same as happened with the technology and digital revolution about 6 or 7 years ago, where we just didn't quite catch up quickly enough. The TfL example, I think, is fantastic, and is a very crisp example of where Emma Coleman, who some of you will be aware of, absolutely flogged herself to make that happen. And more often than not, I think you end up with a single person who has to sort of just not give a shit about the organisational incentive to not share in order to stick their head above the parapet and make it happen. That is not a sustainable way for government to open its data. You can't rely on individuals who have to consistently fight against a culture. You have to actively change the culture yourself.
I guess the precedence gives some succor to anyone who follows. And
it does. It's absolutely fantastic. We can't do it on a one-to-one relationship. We need to do it exponentially.
With that, let's see if we've got some great questions. I see a hand over there on the left-hand side. Yeah, perfect. I think there's mics just coming. Just a brief question would be great.
Oh, brief, okay. Karen Christensen from Open Knowledge. We've got about, I don't know, somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 years of ethics to draw on here. And it always strikes me that we pretend this conversation isn't happening. Human rights is a very recent construct within those 2,000 years of ethics. I think that the really practical challenges of my question to me, it feels like we've got two options right now as advocates, as technical specialists, etc., which is either do we try and get all legislation revised and adapted, you know, every single piece of legislation, primary legislation, you add in data to it relevantly, which would probably get us a far better set of legislation around this. But you know, anybody knows how they're struggling to get anything through Parliament right now. Or do we want a new piece of legislation that reframes everything around data and readapts? And then we've got probably 200 years of court-based activity required to sort that out. Clearly, these are slightly false juxtapositions, but it feels as people wanting to get the ethical frameworks required to catch up with technology that is outstripping us from a legislative and advocacy and delivery capacity so fast it's terrifying, all of us. Which of those tactics is the right one? And that's obviously, I'll go back and try and see what we can do about it. But that's it feels like we've got a decision like that as a community to make about what of those two routes it is.
Thank you. Right, let's see. Nóra, do you want to give it a first shot and we'll just run down the panel?
For sure. I completely acknowledge your point about the fact that in terms of the ethical implications that this isn't new and we've been grappling about institutions with power and then the impact of that on the individual for a long, long time. In terms of the approach of adding data to all legislation that we have, I must admit, I think that would be unhelpful. I do think that you have a lot of pieces of different legislation that are specifically tailored for certain purposes, and I think this goes back to Kit points again about different approaches that you raise for different purposes, particularly with regard to different contexts. I do think what would be useful would be to draw on the existing laws that we have and to see what they can offer us in terms of how they can address these new technological policy questions. So what can we learn from data protection legislation? What can we also acknowledge, are its drawbacks right now in terms of what Martin mentioned in terms of the fact that a lot of these laws drafted in the 1970s, technology is very different now. Mm-hmm. In terms of competition law, what can we learn from that to apply this to new sectors? It's not about the focus on money anymore as the good, it's about data. How do we assess and value that? So I think we need to focus more on building on the current laws and the current frameworks that we have.
Kit?
I agree. I don't think there's any... I would always resist any false dichotomy in this area, as I would in all of this stuff, because it's so nuanced. But I don't think there's any argument either for sweeping everything away and trying to do data in a blob or add a tiny weeny clause to existing legislation. This is why we need, so multidisciplinary working is so vital for this, because when you're working with any, for example, legal team, they will also be extremely naive in the technological aspects of data. Data experts will be relatively naive in the use of regulation. You need to come together to come to a sensible position. And to me, having done that and when you're trying to reinterpret parliamentary intent, as we frequently had to do when we were doing this for the digital revolution in the last 6 years or so, you have to look at what they meant at the point they made that legislation, how you can then harness it in a new environment. And frequently that involves going back through Parliament to have those conversations. You need people who are skilled in doing that, as well as new technological experts to be able to have the conversation about the implications of that.
Look for the mens rea in Parliament, lucky you. Martin, on this point.
Sure, so thanks, Karen. I think there's a massive failure of vision on our part right now, and I really worry that regulation, to be honest, whether it's a big piece of regulation or it cuts across, all it's doing is running after what the tech is doing and trying to fill in the gaps, saying that's a bad thing that happened, and by the time you filled in the gaps, other things have happened. And my sense is we need to take a lot of steps back, and that was my point about the OECD principles from the 70s. I think they did a fabulous job in the 70s, and now we need to take a step back and say, what do we think is happening? What do we think will be happening with data and its impact on our lives and its impact on our ability to have agency as human beings in the next 10, 20, 30 years? So my take on it is we need to have the equivalent of a Bill of Data Rights, like you have the Bill of Rights in the States, which would say, you know, I was just scribbling it, like no person shall have their behavior surreptitiously manipulated. And look at that level, you know, that sort of a fairly high level in terms of the outcomes that we want as societies, and then figure out what the policies shall be. I am amazed that, for example, one last very quick thing, on the issue of consent, you know, you ask experts in the field, like, is informed consent still relevant in the age of machine learning? And people, by and large, will say, not really. Well, what should replace it? Don't know. That's very scary.
Claire.
I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I think what's happening now on taxation is quite an interesting kind of microcosm of this debate. Obviously, it's another way of getting value from data is taxing profits that are made with data that we haven't talked about yet, and the various different attempts to do that. Do we need some completely new tax, or is this just about finding better ways of taxing profits in the way that we've always done, and what combination of the two? So I think that's quite an interesting kind of little microcosm in one area of some of those debates that you put. But I mean, fundamentally, I agree with Martin. I think, firstly, this is about leadership and politicians wanting to do this stuff and knowing what it is they want. And then you work out the sort of the tactics that are required to achieve that. But we don't really know what we want yet. So it's kind of hard to answer.
The next speaker, our question is down here, gentleman at the front. And then please queue up some other questions. There might be some. Yeah. Thank you. Good.
Sorry, I'm a bit jet lagged. I just got off a plane from Toronto at 6 o'clock this morning. So I'm a psychiatrist with a law degree who teaches bioethics at the University of Toronto. And I'm also on the board of directors of Canada's largest mutual defense organization for medicine, the Canadian Medical Protective Association. So I heard, I had to bring up this topic again, GDPR, but Canada used to have the strictest data regulations, and then GDPR supplemented. But I guess the question that, to try to inform the panel, we heard from David Allan of DeepMind speak about a colleague this morning who had defined that in terms of regulation, that she saw brakes in a car allow a car to go faster. So that regulation actually allows you maybe to innovate faster rather than be an inhibition, which is sort of some of the themes that I was hearing that, oh, you know, GDPR might prevent innovation. But to my point was, I heard a presentation in Ottawa on Friday from Ipso, of Ipso fame, and they said GDPR is just the beginning of data regulation. It's data light in terms of privacy. It's expanding, not decreasing. And I just wondered if I could hear from the panel whether or not the idea that increasing regulation might actually innovate faster, because people then feel safe, companies feel safe to innovate faster, and that GDPR is just the beginning.
Perfect. Should we start the other side?
Yes.
Yeah, please. Just
okay.
in the interest of fairness.
I mean, I think in a sense, you know, we'll never know. There's a counterfactual there. I think it's a very plausible hypothesis. And I think from, you know, it's interesting to look always at other sectors. I think you can look at the evolution of health technologies here. You know, the system of ethics and of the rules around drug testing and all of those things have been in a process of sort of continual tightening around the world since ever probably. And we're still getting lots of innovation. So I think there are examples from other sectors where you've had continual tightening of regulations and that hasn't stifled innovation. So I think, you know, there's no particular reason that I can think of to think that data is going to be radically different to any of those other areas of technology. And also, it's also a question of, as always, a trade-off. You know, absolutely, innovation isn't the only thing that you want. There are other things too, like, for example, fairness. So it's also always about trading off those things.
Martin, GDPR make you drive faster?
Yeah, I think there's a completely false dichotomy. I agree. I think there's a false dichotomy between innovation and regulation. And I think it's fed with people who have a lot of vested interests. I mean, I think, like amazing innovations, like, ensuring that people spend as much time as humanly possible on YouTube all the time and watch like completely insane videos one after the other. It's innovative, but having a regulatory framework which says, well, as Tristan Harris and other people say at the Centre for Humane Tech, that the innovation we want is how do we ensure that that time is well spent? How do we innovate in different ways so that people can be more in charge of their time? I feel, to my earlier point, to the first question, I feel that a lot of the innovations now, the risk is that we have less and less agency over how we spend our time. Innovations that give us some of that agency back, I think, are warmly welcome. That's why I think it's a false dichotomy.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. Most of the data innovation in this country is to do with making people spend more money or disconnect themselves from reality. It would be really nice if some of the innovation were to go towards making people more equally treated. Even, sorry to invoke the title of this, Growing Data's Value for Market and Citizens. If you're a migrant, that's a really offensive title. So how you innovate around the ethical use of data to make society more equitable as opposed to having them run on Netflix, which is you're absolutely right. Most of the algorithmic innovation is towards things which belong up in ivory towers with twiddling moustache people with cats in their laps. So it'd be really nice to have innovation that was a bit kinder to people and to create the conditions for success for that. I mean, maybe GDPR, maybe more regulation, but the actual conditions for success are mainly driven by having people who care deeply about it and are paid to do it, I think.
I think that's a really good point about the title, actually. I mean, why is it not growing data values for markets and individuals as opposed to citizens? And as an Irish woman in London in this particularly interesting Brexit time, that's become an ever more live issue. In terms of GDPR, is it just the beginning? That's like a mission statement, or the beginning of a film trailer. Is it the beginning? The GDPR is a living instrument. And I think that's hugely important, going back to the first question that you mentioned in terms of law always chasing up with technology, because of course technology is going to move faster than lawmaking. But when it does, we should keep calm and remember that we also have other institutional competencies in place that will address that. So for example, the courts. When we had the 1995 Data Protection Directive, when that was drawn up in the early 1990s, nobody knew what Google was, nobody had a search engine, but then a decade later, it had to then be decided by the highest court of the EU whether search engines and Google fell under EU data protection law, which they decided was the case. And that's a design for fairness in terms of the role that they play in society, and the fact that we then got a new right in terms of the right to be delisted from a search engine. So I think I'm trying to keep on a quite positive note here in terms of
some of the tools.
That we do, exactly. No, we do have some of the tools, but we need to improve them and make them more tailored to the challenges that we have now.
We've got time for a few more questions. There's a lady up right at the front in the checked top. Is it checked? It is. I've got astigmatism, I can't read. Patterned, right.
Definitely black and white in some fashion.
Right.
I'm Irina Bolachevsky, Director of Redecentralize, which is a kind of institute looking at systemic changes for how we might distribute power and use decentralization as a way to create a more fairer, empowered digital world. And I mean, I actually really love this discussion. I think there's a huge amount that is important around looking at how do we actually use regulation to protect people's rights and processes. I think all that stuff around, we don't, walk into somebody's house with a water testing kit thinking, it's my responsibility to make sure the water is safe to drink, whilst we're kind of in this weird conversation where, it's my responsibility to figure out whether these terms and conditions are exploitative or whether this new app, is going to then sell my credit card details somewhere, and I won't have a business bank account, which is business bank card that is valid, which is the situation I'm in now after someone bought Domino's pizzas with my business bank account over the internet.
Sorry to hear that.
However, we do pay for water. I think there's a thing about funding. We need the kind of accreditations and processes around ensuring trust that is about collective, not individual responsibility, but it is also about funding. I mean, there's something about...
We're a bit short on time,
Okay.
so could I get to the question so the panel gets...
Right, okay, so the question is, I think, basically, how do we provide those fundings? Also, technology does move really fast, and regulation is really hard. Like, technology is different at the rate of speed of change. So in what way can we actually, start thinking about the values of which we assess things against? Probation periods for policies, more data-driven, less just about money, and yet fund them
Right, I'm
effectively.
going to summarize that briefly, because we're on red here. Given that technology is moving so quickly, what can we do to create policies that will be future-proofed against some of the unintended consequences of regulating too quickly? I think that's a reasonable summary, and you can see your time on the clock, 15 seconds apiece.
Okay.
Nóra.
I do think that new advisory boards that are multidisciplinary, that take in all the different perspectives of expertise, like the newly established Center for Data Innovation and Ethics at the ODI will be working on these key questions, is a more rapid-fire response to a lot of these emerging issues than policy making will be. It will also help to inform it in future.
Kit?
Stop talking about data and start talking about skills. There we go, 30 seconds.
People do the work, right.
Two things. The top line piece, we need to agree on the outcomes we want, the bit of data rights. And the other one, I will quote my colleague, friend, Alex Dunn, the founder of the Engine Room. We need agile ethics. We need to apply the agile approach to ethics as we do to tech development.
I heard the question slightly differently, which was about the bit of it that caught my attention was the how do you pay for this? Mm-hmm. And I think, we pay for clean air and clean water and no potholes in the roads by tax. So I think, that's how government is funded. And if we're looking to governments to be the guarantors of our rights for data, then that's how we fund governments.
Thank you. Well, thank you to the panel. I'm afraid we're out of time for questions, but I'm sure you're all on Twitter, so it can be followed mercilessly and mercifully. Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks very much.